So to the ballot box once again, this time for governorship elections taking place this weekend in 28 out of Nigeria's 36 states. Because of Nigerian law, we can't report on specifics such as the candidates and their chances, or on things like their campaigns, which have now officially and legally ended. The law prohibits us from talking about anything that might influence the elections, but we can certainly engage in predictive analysis of the key issues that might shape that ballot. And in that regard, the respected election analysis think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, or CDD, has released its report highlighting 6 key themes that it says would shape the election, while also providing insights into the challenges such as violence, cash, fuel scarcity, and the perception that the Electoral Commission, INEC, may once again fail to get it right. With more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the Director of the Center for Democracy and Development, or CDD, Idayat Hassan. Thank you very much, Idayat, for coming in.
Oh, thank you.
Busy period for you, no doubt.
Yeah, it's a festival of democracy once again.
Absolutely.
And it will soon be over, and the business of governance and holding elected officials accountable will begin.
And that's another key issue, but let's leave that issue for now. Your much prized report on the key issues likely to shape the electoral process on Saturday has just been released. Briefly distill for us the crucial elements contained in that report. I mean, it seemed quite hard-hitting when I read it.
Okay. Interestingly, I think the report, of course, gives hope and believe that these forthcoming elections are actually quite important, because we keep saying in the report that politics is local, and it will actually be local tomorrow. But 2 key things will define how these elections will come out before we start framing the question. That will be the institutional preparedness, how well INEC is able to conduct the elections, as well as the issue of violence. These 2 issues will determine the integrity quotient for these elections. And I think to put out straight before framing the issues, we should also note that these elections will not be conducted by INEC Abuja. These elections will be conducted in the 36 states of the Federation by the Resident Electoral Commission or any appointed staff or committee that INEC may have set up, such as in Sokoto, the special one led by the admin secretary and staffers from Abuja. And this means that the level of the performance, the coherence, is not expected to be the same in these elections. You can think in terms of the fact that the competency, the ability, the leadership character of the person who is in charge at that level will come to play. The role institutions will play beyond the Independent National Electoral Commission will also importantly differ in the forthcoming elections. And all this put together will actually talk about how possibly they would actually be able to reduce violence or otherwise, and determine the quotient of integrity in these elections. But in terms of framing the issues, I think we came up with the 6 important points of identity as extremely important. So while identity played a very huge role in the February 25th elections, it will play as much role in these elections, but framed in different ways.
But when you say identity, what do you mean?
So by identity, we talk in terms of ethnicity, but in these elections, it's not necessarily going to be ethnicity. It could also be the politics of zoning, or even zoning around senatorial districts, where they say that Zone A, Zone B, or Zone C should actually provide the candidates in these elections, or religion, which we will see in several states will be the determining character of these elections. Generational identity will come in, but we keep saying that young people are not a monolith. They are spread thin, while gender and important variables, and indigenous group versus non-indigenous groups or intra-group identity playing up in these forthcoming elections. And when you look at gender, the Adamawa one might actually be what we will be looking up to see how it defines the elections itself, if women will turn up or otherwise. But important is the institutional preparedness in these elections. Following the February 25th elections, we saw that there were several challenges, technical glitches, late opening of polls, late opening of polls, people keeping on the polls for a day, or even seeing people who slept actually at the polling unit. We had people leaving the polling unit by 5 a.m. This will impact turnout. These are critical actions. The 1 week INEC has an extra to reorganize itself. It's expected that it will become extremely beneficial, and there would be the functionality of the beavers will be high, and the high rev as an accountability platform will be well deployed in these elections.
Right.
And this
that's a hope, isn't it?
It's something that we do expect will actually happen itself, because this will be well scrutinized. The effective deployment of technology, for instance, has been the most scrutinized factor from the February 25th elections, and is defining the framing of the whole outcome itself. So how that works will become an important pointer in this Saturday's elections, as we are thinking out of. So the promptness, and maybe they can actually overcome the perception versus reality, or reality versus perception challenges at the end of this itself. And the voter turnout is also equally important.
I'm going to actually come to those points, because I'm glad you kind of given us a bird's eye view. But let's start with probably the most worrying aspect of what you found, which is the issue of violence. Where are the hot spots for election violence in Nigeria? Which states are the big flashpoints?
I think that almost all the states, because of this politics, is local. But Rivers, Lagos, Sokoto, Kano, Kaduna, and think even of Zamfara are very important elections to watch in these elections. And these are also important because these elections do have a history of inconclusive polling itself. So the nature of the contest, how hotly contested it is. Some of these 6 issues that we have pointed out, the way it will actually play in terms of defining the contest is very, very important, and the actors themselves will be extremely important. So if care is not taken in these states, particularly those 4 with a history of inconclusive elections, which, if you look at Rivers, it is not just what is happening on ground. You see that the history of contest in 2015 ensured that polling went into like 3 rounds in the 2015 elections. In 2019, it was the same. It was violent on the day of elections. Then we still had to conduct supplementary elections. And you found the same also in Sokoto. You found the same in Kano. And I think Bauchi also experienced the same, but the vote was called eventually when they were able to recalculate the vote. So the possibility of inconclusive elections are extremely high in this polling itself. Then the contest, and from what we even saw from the 25th elections, which should always be like a benchmark both for the positive and for the negative, again shows that voter intimidation has become a strategy. Overvoting, different ways have become a strategy. And you expect to see that where you have closely contested races. So you have 18, so we say in 17 states, there is nobody on the ballot. The 11 where you have the incumbents on the ballot become extremely important. And you look at this state again, 18 for APC, 10 for PDP. And now some of the contests have become like a 3-party, 4-party races at the state level itself. So it will be extremely contested, and it will actually allow for the possibility of more violence.
Right.
Then with the new technology, which I think that should be my final point itself. The technology, when you look at the numbers of votes that were turning in the presidential elections, it wasn't just about turnout. It's also telling us that the credibility of those votes, like aside from Kano, where of course we also physically saw the huge turnout, but in places where we previously had like 1 million votes, it was so difficult to actually turn out 500,000 votes, which tells you that the technology might actually be working itself, even if we have not actually perfected it, which calls for new ways of rigging. And these ways of rigging will then be to ensure cancellation in opposition stronghold, allowing for more cancellation and heightened violence in the elections.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, because I read in your report where you were saying that closely contested races were likely to see vote buying, we're likely to see voter suppression, intimidation, attempts to co-opt INEC staff. And you also made a very important point, which is the fact that money, the old Naira notes are back in circulation, and they came back before the election. So all those things likely to play a role.
They will play a role. I think in the February 25th elections, we saw vote buying in cash and in kind. We saw dollars being spent, we saw safer being spent, we saw items like clothing, phone, telephones, and food stuff being given out. But in every presidential elections, vote buying is never prominent, like in subnational elections. I have a phrase of always saying that it's not possible to buy up the whole country. But in subnational elections, there are always increased vote buying, and that will play out in these elections, either with the old Naira note or without the old Naira note, because the contest means that you must be able to incentivize people to ensure that they vote. But we still also remain optimistic that even with the scarcity of the note, we saw people vote their conscience in the last elections.
Or attempts to vote their conscience.
To vote their conscience. Yeah. Yes, we saw attempts. We saw states where some people just basically vote without paying anything itself. So we hope that positive light will continue to reflect, but we expect and project that there will actually be increased vote buying. Right.
So vote buying likely to be higher than the presidential election.
Exactly.
And also because the old Naira notes are back in circulation. So based on your report, do you think this election will be reasonably peaceful and free and fair? And I use the word advisedly when I say reasonably peaceful. Or do you expect it to be violent on a much larger scale than the presidential election, with issues around the credibility of the polls surfacing once again?
Subnational elections are always violent than the national elections. So there is a trend. So here we are not even just talking in terms of comparing 25th to this. It's been like a trend. When you look from 1999, you see 2003 elections, 2007, 2011, even the 2019 elections itself, because that is the whole phrase politics is local. The intermingling factors, the mobilizing either on ethnic, on money, on any form of basis are always higher. And here now you should even start thinking of politics of 2027 and the importance of spread is become important and salient for people to note. So often than not, it is violent, and we do not expect to see anything different from it. But when it comes to the credibility of the post, I think that was my initial signpost, that what we determine it will also come up to the level of the violence and the institutional preparedness to organize these elections. So if, for instance, if INEC is actually able to organize properly these whole processes across the states, and the security agencies properly deploy security who are able to maintain law and order, I think that is extremely critical for tomorrow. Because during the February 25th elections, we did not get as much deployment as expected. While we commended the security agencies in terms of their decorum and the kind of improvement we saw, but having one person in a polling unit of 500 or 1,000 is actually inadequate. And if you have that in an elections projected to be quite different tomorrow, that will not help matters. So these institutions will be extremely critical, and the ability to reduce violence to the integrity quotient you can actually have in these elections. I don't talk about free, fair, and credible. It's really the integrity quotient that will actually that will matter in these elections. And I think one thing we should also footnote at every point in time is that it's a large country and things will be happening simultaneously. Some people are only focused on some parts. Some things will also be happening that might be positive or negative in smaller states without us actually focusing on it.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that you're not going to look at it from the point of view of free and fair elections, because, I mean, we've heard people saying that this last presidential ballot was the freest and fairest election in Nigeria since 1999. Is that what you found? Because I know you released reports subsequent to that, I mean, prior to it and subsequent to it. I mean, or are they not looking at it holistically? Because according to many assessments, every part of this country witnessed a form of electoral violence, and there were lots of allegations of intimidation, evidence of logistical failures and malpractices.
I think really why I always use integrity quotient is like, maybe I'm from the Preparedness school of thought when it comes to elections. It's not just the science, it's not just about observing elections, it's the science of elections that we actually study at the CDD. So it's about saying what is the quotient, not just putting
ultimately
this,
of course it's about people's votes counting.
So it's so really for us in the elections, I think we framed our views based, I think, 4 issues. Elections, the operational challenges, which we believe that it really had a lot impact on the elections itself, and these are quite important. These are quite important factor itself. The voter behavior as something that is also extremely important in these elections. The reduced turnout, reasons that are actually we expressed for this reduced turnout, I think in places the polling time constraint and voter intimidation are part of our reasons for reduced voter turnout, not just the issue of people not wanting democracy or something, as we often say. And we talked about the violence and voter intimidation as a very important component of the elections. While we continue to say that maybe the levels were not as widespread, but also some of those incidences, if you start reading it from pre-elections, it was actually monumental. Our briefing today, we were able to identify at least 106 incidences of violence since the beginning of January, and that is based on the Nigerian election tracker watch, or that my colleagues will be that we do with HACLIT, which is the global violence monitoring body itself. And I think that is actually worrying when you look at it and what happened on the day of elections. And you will find that from that day of elections until yesterday, we just had like 6 death figures. But since yesterday, the numbers are actually ramping up. And there is actually the silence of a graveyard that we are looking at. And I think the final point for us in the presidential elections was the role online falsehood also play and is continuing to play in these elections. But I also think that there are positives that have actually arisen from these elections. We focus so much, maybe the process itself has actually kind of taken away the legitimacy quotient of the outcome in itself. But the outcome is not just the presidential elections. When you look at the national elections, you see that lots of things have actually happened, and there has been a lot of shift looking critically at the 325 seats, House of Representatives seats so far declared, or the 101 senatorial seats declared. The way everything has changed, people have lost region and made inroad into a particular part of the country. New parties have emerged. Even in terms of voter literacy, you start looking at how parties, how citizens themselves are able to identify the symbols of some political party to vote them and ensure that they won in these elections. And the fact that we will have a bouquet of 8 parties in the National Assembly, the biggest since the return to democracy in 1999, I think is a positive from these elections. But when you come from the point of view that it's not really the outcome that actually matters, the processes that lead to those outcomes are quite important, then you'd be like, okay, what is the essence of actually talking about some of these key findings, or people are not interested in hearing about it because of unmanaged expectation. They overpromised and INEC under-delivered to Nigerians.
Besides, I mean, election malpractice, which you've identified clearly was prevalent, is not something that should be borne with fortitude, is it? I mean, it should be, you know, it should be attacked head on. I mean, wrestled to the ground, overcome by sheer force of opposition and iron will, because that's what ultimately people look at. You know what I mean? They're afraid of those things. We've got about a minute and a half, and thank you for your very informative analysis there. What's your recommendation for how we slowly make our way out of this electoral process crisis? Because you talked about process, because clearly where things are not working and reforms to the process that make people feel more included are necessary. I mean, you know, we need to see that, don't we? Something that gives the people more of a voice, makes them feel more trusting of the system. All those things are needed. What's your recommendation?
I think it will have to get, I was taught something new today. They call it political diabolism. One of our analysts has written something about it. It's really attacking the root of it. Because here, institutions matters, but institutions are peopled by people themselves.
Absolutely.
So we are talking, so it's not just about law, but the law in action. We are not talking about having regulations, it's the implementation of these regulations itself. So we have to get to the root of it, and we have to get it from the bottom up to the nature of our political parties, the way our institutions work, the way the citizens themselves work, and finally see this opportunity to elect new leaders that will actually make the change. We shouldn't be despondent. We should know that there is still an opportunity to renegotiate democracy, and importantly, the actors should pursue the full limit of the law at every point in time, because it's not just about getting their mandate, it's also about deepening democracy.
Very interesting. Always fascinating talking with you, Idayat. Thank you very much indeed for coming in, and we'll be looking forward to getting your post-election analysis. Thank you ever so much. Idayat Hassan is the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, or CDD. Thank you.